Welcome back to HFO Multifamily Market Watch, your trusted source for information for apartment owners and investors. Multifamily Market Watch is presented by Pacific Exteriors Northwest, a contractor specializing in siding and exterior envelopes and delivering exceptional quality and service for over 30 years. And by Gantry Incorporated, the nation's largest independent mortgage banking firm.
Welcome back to HFO Multifamily Market Watch. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. And today we're lucky to have with us Carter Nelson. She's Director of Government Affairs for the Washington Multifamily Housing Association. Thank you, Carter, for taking the time to speak to our audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Greg.
I know it's been a pretty busy year this year up in Olympia, so maybe we'll get into the specifics of kind of the rent control bill that passed. But going into the session, what were the top priorities for the Washington Multifamily Housing Association entering the session? And then how did it kind of shift during the time, from when it started to, we're wrapping up now as we're filming this here at the end of June?
Yeah, no, great question. So every year we get together with our Government Affairs Committee, and as a team we decide kind of our top legislative priorities. And so going into session, our big priorities were first and foremost opposing a rent cap in any form, and we'll get into that. Trying to improve the eviction process. I think we're seeing this across the board, but especially in Washington and primarily in King County, evictions are taking almost a year or more in some cases, and that's bad for residents, it's bad for housing providers. And so we've just, continued to advocate for a better process that's more predictable and transparent for both parties. So that was one big priority. And then, one of our top priorities, and we're going to continue this into next year, is advocating for statewide preemption. So uniformity in kind of the laws that dictate the landlord-tenant relationship. We're seeing a patchwork of regulations across Washington state that could differ in a way that residents don't even know, right? In neighboring cities and counties, everybody seems to be adopting their own versions of regulations. And so we're really going to continue advocating for uniformity throughout the state when it comes to those regulations. And then our other big focus is always maintaining that the multifamily housing industry is a job creator, contribute significantly to the economy, and the way that sometimes our industry is talked about in media and especially in legislation doesn't really do it justice how much we're driving the economy here in Washington state and everywhere where there is multifamily housing, right?
Well, I think there's a perception. I think people forget that it's rental housing providers are providing a service, a need that's out there, and sometimes they're treated a little bit differently. But I think that's nationally, but locally, definitely in the Pacific Northwest, I think we're getting the brunt of it. Do lawmakers understand the nuance of when they don't have this preemption, that you've got different regulations, by county, by city? Were they receptive to that, kind of that idea to, let's get something that's similar across the whole state?
It kind of surprised me. I think there really wasn't a lot of receptiveness, especially from Seattle lawmakers. I think that because the city of Seattle, if you're familiar, has some of the strictest regulations probably in the country.
Yes.
And, they want to keep those. And so the conversation around preemption is frustrating for them because they see those regulations as protecting folks, and we see that as hurting the entire housing market, which obviously impacts residents. And we're starting to see the fallout of that. The Seattle Times just dropped an article yesterday about affordable housing providers selling off properties because they are operating in the red and are unable to continue providing that housing for residents that meet that affordability threshold. And so that part of the conversation about preemption, I think people see it as a threat coming for work that they've advocated for, but how we see it is, across the board, a way for residents to understand their rights and understand what regulations dictate their relationship with their housing provider, and hopefully have just a better relationship and process for everybody involved.
Well, we've talked about it, multiple times on this program, just they've really, without the understanding, I think, from lawmakers of what goes into managing a property, especially a multifamily property, and the nuances of that happen. There's a lot of regulations that get put in place, and they don't really understand what the consequences are of that. And I'm not talking rent caps or anything like that. I'm just, from posting notices to all these things that they don't really understand how that does. And then to think that You cross one side of the block versus the other, and it's completely different. It's just interesting that, again, and they don't realize the cost it's adding on. And you kind of hit on something with the nonprofit groups that are now having problems from operational, and we're having the same thing in Oregon. I think you're going to see it probably across the United States, but specifically on the West Coast, of issues of operations because of some of the regulations. And again, a lot of times the nonprofits don't want to get out and say anything publicly, but now you're going to see it as they start, financially having some serious problems. So let's talk about the big one in Washington. I mean, actually last year, the big thing in Washington we heard nationally was, gosh, King County is just, you just can't get people out of the units. I mean, it's taking forever. But now you've got that added on with the rent control bill, it was EHB 1217. Can you talk a little bit about, the first iteration that came through and then what actually did pass? And then we can get in kind of what your guys' strategy was and how, did it work, did it not work?
Yeah, great question. And it's one of those, it went through such a journey. And it was initially introduced, I think some of the biggest components that we were nervous about that were, in addition to the rent cap, were a 180-day notice requirement for rent increases. And we already have a couple jurisdictions in Washington that have that, Seattle included. And I hear regularly from operators in those jurisdictions that it is one of the most onerous requirements to give 180 days notice. Not only does that hurt and kind of challenge those variable lease term options for residents, because if you're required to give 6 months notice, you pretty much have to give an increased notice from the start. And
right.
That frustrates residents and the providers that have to give those notices, right? So we were able to knock that down to 90 days, which we think is reasonable. 3 months gives residents enough time to think about their options, explore other places to live if that's what they need to do, and also gives the operators more predictability. So I'm really happy that that's where we ended up. When it was initially introduced, it was a 7% flat cap, which it went through a journey. When it was in the Senate, we were able to get a 10% cap, which was nice. And so we ended up with a 7% plus CPI capped at 10. And so, while that's not a win in our minds, it's better than what we started with,
right.
Especially considering inflation and how much that impacts our industry and all other areas. And so, we think that if you're going to cap rent, it should definitely play a
so kind of in line with what Oregon did. Oregon started with the CPI, and then now we're down with a 10% CPI, but it's a 10% cap. So they matched, kind of modeled after that.
Exactly. And I would say Oregon was a talking point throughout session on both sides when we're talking about comparing active rent control policies, Oregon, California, and then looking at some other jurisdictions on the East Coast. But really, I think the best comparison is those states that are closer to us. And unfortunately, brought up Oregon, we were advocating for a new construction exemption of, we got it to 15 years, and then where it ended up on final passage was 12 years. And unfortunately, that's less than the new construction exemption in Oregon and in California, which we believe puts us at a comparative disadvantage when we're trying to attract capital for new projects. And that was a talking point with legislators that didn't really click with a lot of people. And I think we're not really going to see the negative impacts of that, for a couple of years, but we are concerned about it.
And are there other, well, you're going to be able to see now that, Oregon's had it in place for a while. You can now start seeing, I used to tell people all the time, don't use Oregon as a case study for the negative effects, the true negative effects of a rent cap or rent control, because, the 10%, or even we were at, 14 with CPI. But I think some of the exemption issues, and as that thing changes, what we're seeing is just to continue every 2 years having to gear up and say, okay, this year, and I think in session there was somebody who was trying to get through 3%. 3% cap and things like that. So as we said, we could probably live with a 10% cap. It's just, are we going to be having to fight this thing year after year after year? I think is one of the bigger concerns.
Exactly. And I think what you're touching on too is the unpredictability that
right.
comes with that looming over you every year. Like, okay, we're going to be continuing to try and keep the cap at what it is and not have it go lower. And that's obviously a big concern moving forward for us.
Yes. And in Oregon this year tried to get, I think, the exemption down to 7 years for new construction. And so that's just, like I said, it's just a moving target. Are there any other exemptions from the statewide in Washington rent control bill?
Yeah, so we did get a LIHTC exemption, so the low income housing tax credit properties are exempted. And we're supportive of that because, they already have different regulations over how much they can raise rent. And we advocate actively at the national level and the state for the continuation of low income housing tax credit opportunities for development. So there's an exemption there. At one point, there was a single family exemption, which didn't end up in final passage. And, I think there's a lot of different ways of looking at that, but generally, if you think something's good for the industry, it should probably be across the board.
And did these single family groups have an issue with that, not having that part of it, not 4 units and under being exempted?
Yeah, I think the realtors did come out, and obviously we're advocating for a single family exemption, as well as, the Rental Housing Association of Washington. And, those are the members that they serve, and it totally makes sense why they'd be advocating for that. Again, I just think our industry and multifamily housing is highly regulated, as we all know, and
right.
Generally those mom and pop providers aren't. And I'm not saying that they should be more regulated. We're anti-rent cap, but if we're talking about a policy that's supposed to stabilize housing, it should probably affect all forms of rental housing.
Well, I tell people all the time that they don't understand we're a very fragmented industry in terms of ownership. You've got institutional, you have, as you said, mom and pops, and then everything in between, family offices, and syndication. So it's a very, from merchant builders to, it's just a very tough industry sometimes to get everybody on the same page, which you can, hindsight, look back and say, well, if we were on the same page, maybe we wouldn't have some of this legislation getting through. But it's hard to get that on the front end to say, can we all get in the boat together and row together and try to offset some of these things? That's been our experience as we've seen. And then there's the lease parity provision in there. Can you explain a little bit of that for people that don't understand that?
Yeah, and I think one thing that is a little harder to understand is that was a win for us, because originally the way the bill was written is they wanted to make sure that month-to-month leases compared to 12-month leases, you couldn't charge more for one or the other.
Okay.
And so being able to have a 5% parity means that you can't charge more than 5% for the same unit if you're offering month-to-month versus a 12-month fixed-term lease. So it was really the intent there is for people to not be, in the legislators' words, punished or having to pay more for a shorter term lease. But really what we're seeing now, the results of that is a lot of our housing providers are not going to be offering variable term leases anymore. They're only going to be offering 12-month leases if they can help it. Or they're going to raise the rents across the board, their rates when, they have a vacant unit, so that they can get a fair price for their month-to-month.
So the unintended consequences, you've got less flexibility for for tenants. I mean, existing and new tenants. So again, I think some of this may come up in the next couple of years as they look back and try to tweak things. You just hope there's the political will to get some of that through. Then I was going to ask a little bit about, we've had it here, the algorithmic rent fixing pricing. I know there was a bill on that. I understand it didn't go through?
It didn't go through, but it's funny you say that, because now we are in the middle of fighting that, the city of Seattle. And I wouldn't say fighting it, trying to kill it outright, but I think trying to educate people who are pushing that kind of policy on what that actually looks like from an operational standpoint. I think there's just a little bit of a misunderstanding. And there's also, we're kind of under the umbrella of that RealPage lawsuit,
right,
the Attorney General in Washington and then the Department of Justice federally. And I'm of the stance that we should be waiting for that pending litigation to complete and see where they land and act accordingly. But instead, we're now going to probably see some version of that in the city of Seattle and potentially again next session.
Interesting. And then for people that, maybe they have a management company, how do you get owners involved in this organization where if they want to, kind of be a little bit more out in front and trying to address some of these issues? Is it going through their third-party management companies, reaching out to you and saying, hey, I want to be involved, I want to go to Olympia, or I want to talk to my representative? What's your kind of recommendation for how they can do that?
Yeah, I think any and all of the above. I think, we're always looking for more members. I always say we're as strong as the membership that we represent, but, I'm always looking for people to reach out, even if they don't necessarily use a third-party management company, but they are somehow associated with the industry. There's a place for you to get involved at WMFHA. We need everyone's voice in these conversations, and I think this is something I'm seeing more and more of. You either get people who are really burnt out and feel like it's a lost cause, or you get people who are really fired up. And right now I'm seeing more people fired up. I think there's momentum of the frustration from last session to really try and make some changes going into Olympia and not just allowing some of these policies to go through. So I think we're hearing more as we're gearing up for campaign season too, and trying to get some new faces in Olympia.
Well, if I could say one thing in our experience is when that legislation passed back here in 2017, it did fire up a lot of members or people that weren't actively, I would say maybe not thinking they're political, to get more involved. As we said, this thing we'd been talking about it for years. Same in Washington, had been talking about it for years. But I hate to say, sometimes you've got to have somebody kind of get hit in the head and say, hey, look, we told you it was going to come. It's come now. Let's prevent this from doing it again and again and trying to get more people involved. So I want to thank you for your action and trying to do this. So it's very, very helpful.
Yeah. Of course, it's the best part of my job is getting members and impacted parties involved. I think that's the way we get balanced, effective legislation, and I think we're not hitting that mark right now as a state.
Well, I think we're seeing that in more than just Washington State. I think in Oregon, California, it's a big boat. It's going to take some while to turn. I think if we can get more people in the boat kind of rowing, I think we can change maybe the perception. Because like I said, I think rental housing providers there's a perception that I don't think it's correct for the services they provide. And at the end of the day, we all want to have safe, livable housing for our tenants and ourselves. And that's what we're trying to provide.
Absolutely. And I think it really goes hand in hand with just the conversation around the housing crisis and shortage that we're seeing. You can't solve this problem without market rate, private owners and operators. And those folks want to continue to house people and be part of the solution. And so we're working on trying to really change the perception of our industry.
Well, we're here to help, and we'll let our audience know how to get in touch with you and the organization, especially for the ones that own it in Washington. And I want to thank you again, Carter, for taking the time to do this. And I'm sure we'll be talking again soon as gear up for the next session and as questions come up. And so I always try to say we can be less reactionary and more proactive, I think is the way to go. But now we can get some momentum going. So again, thank you for taking the time to do this. And we'll see you next time on Multifamily Market Watch. Thank you.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information. HFO is a member of Global Real Estate Advisors. Learn more at GREA.com.